Today we're talking about 7 tips to blow up your squat. More specifically, this would be a great video if you're trying to squat 500 pounds for the first time. This is effectively a checklist on all of the things you should be doing correctly. And also, one thing I will do in this video is actually have a percentage of people that I see do these things as far as so how common this problem is individually on each one. Now, that being said, if you are unfamiliar with my channel, I've squatted 500 pounds for 12 reps, which is probably my favorite lifting accomplishment that I've done.
Oh yeah, they shake.
Anyways, that being said, tip number 1 is doing 3 to 4 exercises in total within the week. And most importantly, considering that 4th exercise slot, but not considering a 5th or more. So what I mean is, let's assume you're squatting twice a week on the regular style squat, your competition squat. And then you have one variation possibly. And then on top of that, so like a pause squat, you could do a front squat. I would say, I typically don't recommend that, but a pause squat, a tempo squat, high bar squat if you're a low bar squatter. So one of those main variations that really has a very clear direct transference is your second movement. And then the third movement being something like a hack squat or a leg press, something where there's a lot of force production in total and you're able to overload it, but at the same time, it has a little bit better transfer than a total isolation. So those would be the 3. And I would say, for most people, almost all the time, they thrive more with doing at least 3 versus doing just the competition squat or even just the competition squat in one barbell variation. I think I've almost never, in my experience with clients over 10 plus years, I've almost always seen home gym goers have a little bit of a downside by having more limitations. Now, that being said, and this is a really big lesson here, is that if you ever do hit a wall, to do a 4th exercise. So it could be something like a leg extension, and this isn't within the same workout, just within the same week. So let's say you have a primary day where you do competition squat, and then you do, leg squat or leg press or hack squat or belt squat, something like that. And then on that secondary day, maybe you normally do, 3 sets of 8 or something with the barbell to then also add in leg extensions. So really make sure that both of those sessions are hitting 5 to, you could even go up to 5 to 8 sets on legs each one of those individual days. And that really gives you that wiggle room to blow up, the sufficient amount of volume you need. You just should not accept stalling for no reason without pushing things a little bit harder. And the beauty of having just enough variation is, of course, you can actually recover more easily than if you're just ramping up barbell volume alone. Now, this is also another important message, is to not go to 5+. Now, I'm not saying this for absolutely everyone. Obviously, there's always going to be unique circumstances, but I would say it's a very rare exception that someone should need another one. And that's where you get to the F around-itis, as they say, is you start to do, you do a high bar day, and then you do leg extensions, and then you're also doing Bulgarians on that day, or then you're also doing something else. I would way rather see someone just add in an extra set on that isolation work at that point. Just dial in. Okay, maybe you do 2 sets of leg extensions, now do 3. Or if you already do 3, maybe now do 4. Or just ramp up RPE and actually hit a true RPE 9 possibly on those leg extensions and just get more out of the same movement rather than just adding in a ton. And that's a really big factor, because when people start to do a little too much, then it starts to get chaotic and very disorganized. And I'd say, especially of people who haven't squatted 500 pounds yet, a lot of times you see they do a good amount of work, but it's just very unfocused. And having 5+ exercises for the legs is a great way to become unfocused, because we know it takes a lot just to squat effectively within the week every single time, because your mental game is just as important as your physical. So that being said, if you are progressing just fine with 2 movements, just the competition squat and one other, that's fine. Just continue progressing until you need more. The main point is, if you're not progressing well enough and you haven't at least done 4 exercises within the week, then at that point, you just don't want it bad enough. Now, my second point is actually emphasizing your strengths. A lot of times people work on their weaknesses and it becomes almost this negative feedback loop where they're not actually just emphasizing what you're naturally built for. And you see this over and over again. Even we could throw back to the OG legend Tom Platz. He had an amazing set of legs, obviously, and he had a very strong squat, but also you could even see in his exercise selection, he took advantage of the fact that he is built well to squat. He has strong knee tendons. He has shorter femurs, most likely, even in proportion to his height, and he already was a manlet. So if you are a shorter lifter, like for example, myself, I have very well-built levers for squatting. It's just very natural to me. It always has been. So for myself, doing things like a hack squat with a low foot placement where there's a lot of forward knee travel. So I'm really emphasizing the dorsiflexion, which is just your ankle flexing. That is very effective for myself right now because I'm working on my high bar ass-to-grass squat. So instead of contrasting against the high bar ass-to-grass squat, I'm actually playing into my strength and doubling down on it. And then you're going to get great transference, but also, again, it's already a position that I can tolerate very well. So I'd say sissy squats, like I said, either low foot placement on a hack squat or a low foot placement even on a Smith machine squat. That's totally fine to use a Smith machine to isolate the quads a little bit, especially if you're well built to squat and you already have a more quad dominant style squat. And then fourthly, I would say Platz squats. And Platz squats have always had phenomenal transfer. I have a video up here. I'll link it or whatever. I don't know. I'm such an old head on YouTube. I'm not even sure they do annotations on the screen to where I could just point to it. I don't think they do. So link in the description. It's probably like 5 years ago they allowed you to do that. But Platz squats have always been very effective for me. And it's something where I've seen it with other lifters and other coaches who are not built like me, who have longer legs in proportion to their total body and are just taller in general, like 6 feet tall or more. Is a lot of times Platz squats aren't necessarily the most effective for them. It helps bring up a weakness, but it can cause more problems than it solves. And there, when you have longer limbed lifters, that's where movements like a belt squat or like a single leg press or like a Bulgarian split squat, where you're not in the maximally stretched position as often, can actually be much more effective. The leg extension also is another one I would add on top of that. So you'd say leg extension, wider stance belt squat, and then lastly, I would say single leg press / Bulgarian split squat. Those are great for lifters who don't find the squat to be a natural movement pattern that helps them build muscle through the lift itself quite as easily. Point number 3 is simply having a higher low bar position. So this is something I see all the time. I would say on form checks on the Candida Forever program, link in the description. I'd say this is one of the most common points I see, and definitely in real life just as well in general in the gym, is it's very tempting to low bar with the bar as low as possible. But then at the same time, I do also think too many people believe that a higher low bar all of a sudden is a mid bar squat or a high bar squat. And then they kind of neurotically, define things or they even try to argue against the definition. I think it's fine to say a low bar squat should just be a little bit higher than some people think. It should be on your rear delt shelf, not below it, not jammed as low as humanly possible. And from a side angle, you should see the bar generally aligned over your midfoot before you even begin the descent. So this is actually an underrated point you see often, or at least I see often, is that people stand with the bar in a very low bar placement and they're a little bit too upright and passively on their heels. And even if they correct that during the descent, typically you're going to see a slight pitching forward. Whereas if you do have a slightly higher low bar position and you're shifted just a little bit forward while standing, again, even though it's a passive position, it's still important because then you can go straight up and down and control that weight. So that higher low bar position helps you stay under the weight rather than the weight tossing you around. So unless you're a French lifter, don't try to be one. Point number 4 is a 2 or 3 step walkout. This is one of the fundamentals, but one that you see people mess up a lot, and I've seen this many, many times, is at most you should have a 3-step walkout. And on top of this, I would actually add another point, is I consider it to be superior to not even look down. So unrack, step back, and then set your feet. And even when you're setting it, don't look straight down at it, because if you look straight forward, a lot of times it helps you keep yourself centered. And also it feels lighter when you're just staying engaged like that and you're locked in. And it is critical to be locked in at all times when under some serious weight. One of my favorite example is John Downing. He is, again, a lifter who is not really competing anymore. It's an old head reference at this point, but he squatted 675 pounds with a perfect, or 650, with a perfect walkout. And then with a two-step walkout, Blaine Sumner is a good example of a more extreme difference where he's a very wide squatter and he actually does have a very low bar position, but he leans forward a lot to justify it. And, and even then he has had hip injuries. So he has an extreme position that I would say most people couldn't tolerate. But you can see that two-step walkout, boom, go right into the squat. So this one's very, very simple, but it's extremely important. And the key point is even if it feels a little bit awkward at first to take a relatively efficient walkout, you will adapt to it. So that desire to fidget is a byproduct of you fidgeting a lot. And then you want to fidget more because you know you fidgeted in the past. That itself gets ingrained. Whereas I found even down to a two-step walkout, that's probably what I will do now, given I am squatting narrower and high bar ass to grass, is you get very used to it. Once you do it from the bar with 135, 225, 315, every single time you squat, you do it with no fidgeting around. You will then naturally adapt to it and you'll never want to fidget again. Point number 4 is to lift in a proper gym. I cannot emphasize enough just how much this matters. A lot of form checks I do, someone's lifting with bumper plates, and that's all that they can have access to, they say. Sometimes it's understandable, but you have to understand that with Olympic weightlifters, they actually get an advantage out of whipping the bar out of the hole, sinking an ass to grass squat, and then potentially getting a boost. So you definitely can tangibly squat, a certain amount more if you're squatting high bar ass to grass with that style, with a weightlifting bar that has no center knurling that's designed to whip a little bit more. However, if you are a power lifter with a low bar squat and you're squatting with a bar with no center knurling and with thicker plates that push the weight out more and more on the sides, it is totally possible that that can restrict your squat progress. It can actually nuke your squat in the moment and make it less predictable across moments and then reinforce bad habits because we don't want to have an explosive, just drop in the hole when you're squatting low bar to just slightly below parallel. This is the main factor for why I went a whole year with zero squat progress. The first time that ever happened to me, it was when having thicker, weirder plates, having these big plastic plates, and it just made it so hard to predict where I should be at. And ultimately, some days I would hit it super fast, and other days it would just not be there. I'd just catch a whip weirdly. So I cannot emphasize enough that even if you have to drive 30 minutes to a gym with real plates, you may have to do that. If you have been struggling with progress, nobody's going to pity you. Nobody's going to save you. Either you figure it out or you may not progress. Ultimately, the choice is yours. So point number 6 is adding an extra day of frequency. Now this is assuming most likely you're squatting once a week and then adding a second day, or if you're squatting twice a week already, adding a third day. And if that is you, then that third day I do recommend be the competition style squat, be something like a 3x3 at RP6 or RP5, and have a bi-weekly progression rather than every single week trying to add load. And that's something I've mentioned on my How to Coach Yourself for Powerlifting series. I'll link that in the description. It was a very detailed video, so I'm sure a lot of people did not actually get to that point possibly because there's just a lot going on. But this is one of the most effective ways to have a motor control prep day, have a primer day, lead into the primary day. So it's important to have that order correctly to where you basically do that midweek and then go into that primary day fresh and ready to go. But it's also important to make sure you don't add too much. A lot of times the moment people add a day, they start adding a ton of other things and then feel like almost insecure, like, oh, every time I squat, I do at least 5 to 6 sets on legs, so I have to do that now. It's like, no, you can completely bend the rules and just add any dose that you're doing. Not only are you adding the work sets, but you're also adding the warm-ups, which do add up across weeks. So I would even experiment this if you are in a plateau. Even with your squatting 3 times a week, it definitely is worth considering squatting 4 times a week. There is no rule in this that you have to only lift 2 to 3 times a week or do this. If you are ultimately stalling, it is worth considering almost anything as long as you feel healthy enough to do it, you're locked in and you're focused. So that's something actually, even I myself, I may consider 4 to 5 times a week squat if it's fitting for myself, given I can tolerate this ass to grass squatting pretty easily. But the main point is when you're doing this, don't chase the volume dragon. Don't combine all worlds. Take it one step at a time. Okay, now we're at our final point number 7. So hopefully if you're watching this, you've already now squatted 500 plus pounds because I already just gave you the most fire tips. You put them in place, boom, it immediately added 35 pounds to your squat. Now the most important tip is point number 7, and that is pacing your blocks at a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of depositing in the bank and cashing out. So what I mean is, let's say we have 12 weeks to make sure that that last block, the 8 to 12 week range, that's where you push it. Or if you have 15 weeks, to make sure that last 5 weeks, that's where you push it. But for the first either 10 weeks or 8 weeks, let's say you're running, again, let's go 12 weeks, you're running 4-week blocks and you're doing 3 of them. Those first 2 should absolutely be on a pace that you know you're going to hit what you're trying to hit, and you feel confident that you're building up to something to where you're not even thinking that like, oh, I need to hit this by this time, and each time almost individually assessing things. You want to assess things in 3 months waves, essentially 3-month macro cycles, right? So that's one of the most important things, because you see all the time whenever someone hits a plateau, it's almost always because they're kind of shortening things too much. They're thinking too short term. They're putting too much pressure on themselves and ultimately not giving themselves space to grow. And you can even play around with this as a intermediate or late intermediate to early advanced. You can play around with, okay, how much do you want to push those earlier cycles in unique rep ranges versus how much you want to keep the rep ranges just a little bit tighter and then just have the RPE be a little bit easier. There's nothing wrong with ending your first block at RP 8 on week 4 and just going RP 5, 6, 7, 8. That is completely fine. And then doing the same again, maybe in a slightly different rep range, and then only pushing to RP 9 or 10 on the end of that. That's completely fine. But of course, for earlier intermediates, I would say you could push to RP 9 or 9.5 even, as long as you're doing different enough rep ranges. But the one point I'll say to the end as well is that's where then the mastery comes in of fine-tuning the differences in rep ranges. So I like to see people push to, let's say, a 10 rep max and then be able to do 10 rep max and then either hit something like a triple phase and then a 1 rep max phase, if possible, if you can handle that amount of variance. I think that's a really good way to keep things fresh. And ultimately, I think 10s are phenomenal for building strength on the squat. So if you're someone who you notice, oh, that didn't transfer really over by the end of that, even though you had decent momentum, then you can start just scaling things down. And then maybe you end up getting to a point, and I had a former client where it's exactly in this position, where the best decision ended up being 7s. So being like 7s, 4s, and then singles. And just a little bit more subtle jump. And that can be a great tactic to where then now you're controlling things and you're reassessing things. And now you have control over, okay, so I know how I'm going to push this squat. And I know what intensity range I need throughout the year. Yet at the same time, those first 2 cycles are not being compared to that last cycle. And that is absolutely critical. So that being said, make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're hearing this running, well, what program should I run then? Well, then you can run the 10 rep max phase, followed by the 8-week program if you're more of an intermediate lifter and want to push things hard. Or you could run the 10-week phase, followed or preceded by the 3 rep max phase, which would be a 15-week phase, doing exactly what I'm talking about with a tighter 3s, 2s, 1s. So that's it, guys. Make sure to like the video. Again, join the Forever program if you're intrigued, if you want to gain some significant strength applying these principles. And ultimately, it comes down to, when it comes to the squat, you got to be locked in and you have to figure it out. Because if you don't squat 500 pounds, why are you even lifting?